I'll be my best behaved. So, how many of you were in the convention this past weekend? Almost everyone. Okay, that's good. There's something interesting about the Bible, and if you read it regularly, and I hope you all do, you might notice that first of all, there's a selection in terms of content. The Gospels themselves say that if we wrote down everything that Christ did or said, the world itself cannot contain the books. So there is a criteria for things being selected to be included in the Bible. What do you think the criteria is? Why are the stories that are in the Bible included in the Bible? When you think about Christ and the things that he's done, the things that he taught, what's any patterns pop up in your mind? I think they're milestone stories. They're gate stories. This past Sunday, we read the gospel of the raising of the son of a widow, and this happened at the gate of a city. And most of the events, most of the miracles that Christ has done, they're at the gate. They're at, maybe not always at a physical historical gate, at the beginning of somebody's life, at a milestone in somebody's life. Imagine Zacchaeus when he comes down from that tree and has Christ coming to his house for dinner. This is a milestone in his life. This is something big. This is something huge. Imagine if you invite someone, even if you didn't believe at the time that Christ was God, but he believed that he was someone special. And having him come into his house and have dinner with his family, this was a big deal. This was a big event. When we look back at the Old Testament and we see stories like in the book of Ruth, and the big event at the end with Boaz redeeming Ruth and her family, this act of redemption where he takes claim for the family, for their land, for their lives, basically. This happens at the gate of the city. And this was where all the transactions, the important transaction would happen, at the gate of the city. The enemies would come to talk at the gate of the city and to offer peace terms or to offer alternatives, all at the gate of the city. But because all these stories happen at the gate, we might not focus so much about what happens inside of the city. We look at what happens at special moments in someone's life, but not always at what happens every day to day, hour to hour. The boring, the mundane, the normal stuff. Like the disciples waking up in the morning and going out to fish, and then catching the fish, and then selling some of the fish, and then going back home to eat the fish that didn't sell, and then going to sleep. This is a normal day. We don't talk a lot about that. And when we look at just the important, just the big, just the milestone, and we miss out on what's happening day to day, what ends up happening is that we miss out on 99% of the story. The disciples every day were with Christ. Every day he was teaching them. Every day they were asking questions. Every day they were going back and forth with him, walking around, interacting with people. And this is really the important stuff. This is really what we need to look at in our lives, the everyday. Because when we look at just the important stuff, just the big stuff, just the milestone in our lives, and we pursue God during those times, we miss out on God the rest of the time. Like, for example, when you're about to start a program in school, you seek out God and God's will. When you're about to get married, you do the same thing. When you're about to start a job, you do the same thing. When you're about to have a child, you do the same thing. But it's only in those big moments that we really focus on what God wants and what His will is for our lives. But when we focus on what happens every day, we're much better off at discerning God's will, because it's not just about the big, it's not just about these milestones, it's about the everyday. And there's a really basic formula to do that. It's very easy. Our Lord told His disciples to be watchful. That's all it takes, to be watchful. And it might sound normal, boring, routine, like to be watchful, just to be careful. But it takes a lot to be watchful. And there's a lot of experience in our tradition about how to be watchful. There's a lot of wisdom on what men and women have learned, on what works and what doesn't. It's not just about, those big events when there is a big temptation happening right in front of you. It's about this little interaction between you and a coworker, this little interaction between you and this other person on the bus. These are the little moments where we need to be more watchful than at any other time. And there are 3 points I'm going to talk to you about tonight. In order for us to be watchful, first, we have to awaken the intellect. Awaken the intellect. Second, we have to nourish the soul. And third, asceticism of the body. The first one is the awakening of the intellect. The second is nourishing of the soul. And the third, asceticism of the body. There is a reason why the spiritual writings of people from our tradition focus so much on the thought and the discernment of the thought and keeping accountability of the thought. Because it's 99% of the time, it is through the thought that we fall into sin, that we fall into temptation. The devil comes at us through the thought. It's as if to put something in your mind. It impregnates you and it gives birth to the sin. And this thought goes through several stages in order for your mind to actually develop and work with this thought to turn it into sin. And there are several stages. And you might think that some of these people had too much time on their hand and they just came up with these stages just because they're free, they had nothing better to do. But this is coming out, this is being born out of the desert experience. The first stage, they say, is impact. When the thought comes in contact with your mind. And at this stage, your mind might be in whatever state it's in. It might be awake, it might be distracted, it might be asleep. So depending on what state your mind is in, a thought gets in there and waits for your mind to take the bait. At this stage, you're still not falling into sin. There's just bait being offered, and your mind has the decision to make. Do I go for this bait or do I reject it? And most of the time, if our minds are not in a state of alertness, if our minds are not awake, if we're distracted, and most of the time we are distracted, we fall for it. We take the bait. And now more than ever, distraction is a big problem. Now more than ever, and it has a lot to do with the way we live. We're bombarded with information. And our minds can't cope with coming in. We have to organize the information, and we have to make quick decisions on what to take and what to reject. What's important, what's urgent, and what really is irrelevant. And things we have to throw away. We can't focus on, we can't bother, we don't have time for. So in order to do all of this, we spend a lot of effort, and it's exhausting. And that's why we distract ourselves. And another reason is because we live in such a fast-paced world. We use a lot of distractions to cope with the stress that comes with it. And because of this, again, our minds are in a state of distraction. So as soon as the mind sees the bait, it usually goes for it. But at that stage, in that first stage, you're still not falling into sin or anything. Just the bait is being offered. And when the enemy throws a thought or an image at the person that makes contact, just born in the heart and presenting itself to the mind is not being sinful. The mind is just presented with it. And the main way of dealing with this kind of temptation is what the Father says, sobriety of the mind, being sober. It's easy to be sober, like I said, at the milestone. It's easy to be sober when you're so anxious and you're so stressed about this big decision. Should I marry this guy? Should I go for this job? Your mind is sober. But day to day, the mind is just not as sober. So the remedy is to keep it sober. And then we go on to the second stage. The second stage, they call it coupling. Coupling is when the mind takes the bait. The mind begins to engage, to mingle with it. And that bait starts taking the mind to sinful places. It starts taking the mind and to get the person to engage with the thing or with the thought of the sin. They're not very clear on the second stage where, in terms of accountability, but you're borderline. You're starting to fall into sin. The third stage is called merging. And in that stage, the thought has fully engaged the attention of the person. And because of this, the passions, and what the spiritual fathers call the passions, is in the modern way we use the word passion. When you meet someone who's passionate about something, it means they really love something and they're really engaged with it, they're passionate about it. But the passions, they refer to, you can call them like desires, or sometimes even attitude. The passions originally were all in order. And then Adam and Eve fall into sin. And all of a sudden the passions are no longer in order. Instead of being in order, instead of being in a state of contemplation about God, they fall into chaos. And because they fall into chaos, what ends up happening is that the devil now is able to take advantage and turn the passions against the person. So that's why you find when these sinful thoughts get into the mind and inflame the passions, these passions that are these desires that are part of who you are all of a sudden turning against you, working against you, driving you to places, driving you to actions that you wouldn't normally, under normal circumstances, go to. So in that stage, the person is inclining towards sin, inclining towards the enjoyment of sin. The spiritual struggle determines the state of how sinful we come in that stage. The fourth stage, they call it captivity. You're a captive of the thought at this point. The thought has taken over your mind, and you're being led by the thought. And that's why it's our Lord told us to beware the little foxes. It's these little thoughts that you wouldn't look at twice, you wouldn't pay attention to. These are little things that are able to take you captive. We don't like to think of ourselves as liable to fall into captivity. Like it makes us feel vulnerable, like weak, that a small thought can really control how I do things, can really control how I decide and how I look and how I interact with people and with situations. We like to think that we're above that. We're enlightened, we're smart, we're strong, we're educated. But it's these little things that can get us. Christ himself said, whoever commits a sin is not a sinner, is a slave to sin. A slave. So in that stage, the stage called captivity. The thought has taken the soul captive and begins to lead it as if it's a slave towards sin. The state of sinfulness of this stage really and how bad things get depends on something very simple. The state of prayer of the person. Whether I pray seriously or not. Whether I pray regularly or not. Whether I pray with my heart or just with my lips. And then there is a fifth stage. It's when that sin becomes habitual, becomes a habit. And when it becomes a habit in that stage, I no longer need the thought. I no longer need debate. My mind just goes to the familiar place and goes all over again and falls into sin. I told you that story before about this baby that was dropped off at a monastery, raised his whole life in the monastery, and one day they take him to the market, and then for the first time he begins to see all sorts of things and sellers and all this, and then when he comes back and he sees for the first time a woman, and then he's like, what's that? And they tell him, this is the devil. The monks were with him. And then when he comes back, they ask him, what was your favorite thing that you saw? The devil. The solution is for our minds to be sober, to be awake. All of the things, everything that we do, it doesn't necessarily have to take over, necessarily have to dictate how we think. But at a certain point, we give up that control. We allow things to take over, to have power, to have dominion over how we think. And because of that, our minds really just are taken into captivity. And this is the first thing, keeping your mind in a state of alertness. Now, how to do it? It's easier said than done. How to keep your mind awake and alert? Especially that we're creatures of habit, and there are many things, vying for our attention, and there's a lot of stress, a lot of things that we have to do and to cope with. And how do you keep your mind sharp? How do you keep your mind focused? Any thoughts? It's very easy, actually. It's very simple. How do you keep your mind sharp? You know that most accidents happen within 4 or 5 kilometers around from where you live, from your home. Because your mind is going to want to be lazy. So when you drive around your house, you already know the places, you already know the streets, so your mind isn't as active. It's like you're driving subconsciously. Your mind isn't actively engaging with the information, analyzing the information, checking for any danger, checking for any person who's going to run or any driver who's going to cut you off. When you're close to home, your mind's almost shut down, and you're driving just by habit. Okay? The way to keep yourself active and engaged is to force your mind to continue to be active, to put force into it, to put energy and effort into it. Right? Don't take any sort of shortcuts with your mind. Don't take any or give your mind any excuses not to do this, not to be active, but to keep it active, to maintain it in a state of alertness, and at the same time to minimize distractions. minimize distractions. Your cell phone is one of the biggest sources of distraction, right? We take so much time, we spend so much time playing video games and crushing candy and on social media and all that stuff. Like, you know, we have so much time, but because we have the phone just so handy, we reach for it. It's the last thing you reach for at night, first thing you reach for in the morning when you wake up, and it's just ready. It's ready to soak up as much time and attention as you're willing. So make access to the phone more difficult. For example, as a very simple suggestion, don't put your phone in the bedroom. Keep it away from you. Or if you're going to put it in the bedroom, don't put it at arm's length. Because the only thing, you know, we want to be lazy. We don't want to actually get up to get the phone. If it's not within arm's length, it's going to help a lot. All of these things help to keep your mind sharp, to keep it awake and alert. And at the same time, read your Bible. At the same time, read spiritual books. Don't be satisfied with what you get in church on Sunday in the 5-10 minute sermon. Don't be satisfied with what you get, you know, here in the meeting as this being your only spiritual intake your whole week. Read. This is the first thing. The second thing is the nourishing of the soul. And the nourishing of the soul, believe it or not, is something we've learned to ignore since a very young age. Something we learn to put aside because the soul doesn't give you any indication like your physical hunger that you need to give me something now. It just slowly shuts down and gets weaker and weaker and weaker. You have to actually keep it center stage, keep focused on the nourishing of your soul in order for you to continue to nourish it. There's a 4th century monk who came from the West and lived in one of our monasteries, and he was very systematic. And not only did he put kind of a systematic overview of our faith, but he started to notice certain patterns with sins, certain patterns with virtues, and he kind of listed things that inflict the soul and inflict the body. And he said that vices or sins that inflict the soul are much more difficult to heal than those that inflict the body. So as addictive, as captivating as sins of the body, the soul are much more difficult to deal with, are much more difficult to get free of. So I'll give you a couple. But before I do, when we're talking about sins or vices and virtues, when the monks talk about it, is different than laymen, people who live in the city talk about it. We can be in the city, we can be, you know, among people and not living here, and think we have certain virtues, or that we're kind and we're generous and we're humble. But they say once you get to the desert, any fruit that grows in the city usually dies out in the desert. So someone who was a good person and who was kind and generous and humble in the city might have been all of these things because of the feedback, because of the validation they're getting from people. It's different than when you go in the middle of nowhere and you're not getting this validation, when you're not getting this approval from people. They say it in, you know, the fruit that grows on like sewage water doesn't grow in the desert. They call this like all vainglory that makes this kind of fruit grow. I don't want to make you feel bad, but it's think about how much of good you do simply because people are watching, or somebody might see, somebody might recognize, versus how much would you actually do if nobody ever found out that you're going to do something good, right? So the way we nourish our soul, first of all, recognizing sins of the soul. These are sins where the soul is starving. So when the soul starves, it goes to dark places in order to find nourishment. So when the soul is starving, instead of being humble, it goes into pride and arrogance. When the soul is starving, instead of being generous, it goes into selfishness. And the way to nourish the soul is to continually feed it. It's not like you feed it once a year during Holy Week. You're in church the whole week basically, and the rest of the year you ignore it. It's very straightforward, very simple. Every day, stick to your spiritual habit. Every day, when you get up, start praying. Start by prayer. And throughout your whole day, continue in prayer. And St. Paul, when he says, pray without ceasing, that prayer without ceasing might seem difficult if you think prayer is about standing up and speaking with God and telling God certain things about your life and what you want to do and what kind of things you'd like to have. But prayer in its essence is that realization that you are in the presence of God. You are in the presence of God. Once your mind realizes this, then you're in a prayerful mode. Then whatever you do it with prayer. Anything, any thought, it all goes through prayer. Realizing that you are in the presence of God. This is prayer. And there's this story about this old man who tells his grandson about every person having two wolves inside. I think I told it. And these two wolves are always fighting. One wolf is hate, envy, greed, basically everything negative about us. And the other one is love, kindness, patience, everything good about us. And they're always fighting. So the young man asked his grandfather, which one gets to win? And he says, the one you feed. The one you feed. St. Paul talks about two laws being at war in our bodies. The law of the flesh and the law of the spirit. The flesh wants to be lazy. The flesh wants to eat. It wants to indulge. But the spirit wants to be awake, to be alert. It wants to pray. It wants to unite with God. Which one gets to win? The one we feed. Right? Imagine you go regularly to the gym. And then you skip one day. You feel off. You feel like something is wrong. But when you look at this side of the spirit, you skip 1, 2, 3 days without prayer, without reading your a week or two without going to church, without taking communion. It usually happens that you realize you're skipping a week or two into it. So you don't realize right away, like today I didn't pray, tomorrow I didn't pray. A week of not praying, you know what, I haven't been praying. And we deal with the body in a way as if we owe the body a debt. We take care of it, we give it what it wants, we shelter it, we feed it, we give it everything it needs, right? And more. But with the spirit, if there is time, if I'm not too busy, I'll read the Bible, I'll go to church, I'll feed it. So keep in mind, the spirit is like a seed that's been implanted in us. The more you feed it, the more it grows. But the more you ignore and neglect it, it can actually die out. Die out not in the sense that it's extinguished forever, but it gets in a state where there's no way it can withstand any sort of pressure, any sort of temptation. It's no support to you. And finally, asceticism of the body is this thing that we've become very good at. Very good at dodging. Very good at being technical about it. If you don't make your own food, like imagine you're a teenager living at home, okay? and a teenager living at home, playing with your phone, video games, you're not paying attention to what's going on at home, mom's cooking, and she puts the food on the table, and you eat the food, you wouldn't realize whether it was fasting or not. We've become very technical at fasting. Everything tastes exactly the same, but the ingredients change. Right? We no longer deprive our bodies, we just got really good at tricking them. We got really good at tricking our senses. We don't deprive them. Right now, they get exactly what they want, whenever they want. And even when we say, you know what, I'm not going to have certain kinds of food, we're good at making excuses, but I need to have this kind of food. I need to go to the gym, I need to maintain a certain muscle mass, I just need to, right? I have to. We've become very good at this, and because of the body no longer listens. The whole goal of asceticism is not to punish the body, but to keep things in control. I told you earlier about the passions being in chaos. It's about bringing it back into order. Once it gets into order, it obeys, it listens. But once you give it all at once, it acts like a spoiled child. It would never listen to you because you give it everything at once. Why would it listen to you? You have no bargaining power. You have nothing at once. You already got all of it, right? The first thing, awakening of the intellect. And the second thing, nourishing of the soul. And the third, asceticism of the body. Doing these three things, keeping up with these three things, might seem, normal, boring, mundane, but it's these three things that keep us going every day, that keep us alert and awake every day, that keep us in that mindset where we're always seeking the will of God every day, and not just on those big occasions where we're really nervous, we're really anxious, we really want to make sure that we get this right, so I want to get the will of God, make sure it's there and it's lined up with what I'm trying to do, so that I've got the best chance of this thing working out and being successful. It's the everyday that gets us. It's not the big moments. It's those little decisions, little interactions every day that get us in trouble. Any questions?
So you mentioned fasting, which is some people, well, obviously 2/3 of the year, it's a lot. But the days that you don't fast, do you still practice any of those principles, like intermittent fasting or anything like that? Do you abstain from certain foods, or do you just feast?
No, the whole point of fasting is bringing your body under control. So on the days when you're not fasting, you're still keeping your body under control. You don't give it what it wants. You don't indulge. You don't feast. Right? There are no cheat days in Orthodox Church.
So is there any type of, you still deprive yourself of anything?
It's not about depriving, it's about keeping it under control. So, I'll give you an example. With our eyes. With our eyes, we get in trouble not because we see something, but because we look again. Because we look back. Once you see something, and your mind is engaged, it's taking the bait. If you deprive, not deprive, but if you control and say, no, I shouldn't be looking at something like this, or I shouldn't be looking at someone in this way, and you control your eyes and say no, then you've successfully avoided this sinful behavior. But when you give it what it wants, and when you let it have whatever it wants, because today, I'm not fasting, I'm gonna have, all the food, all the chocolate, all the meat, or whatever I want, then your body falls right back into sin. Then all the control I've learned to have, I just lost it all. To start again from scratch. There are 3 stages in the spiritual life. So once we get all that control stuff, and once we get the mind is awake, the intellect, the mind is awake, your soul is nourished, your body is under control, then you can begin to build. Then you can begin to, because you laid the foundation, you can begin to build up. You've built the wall, you can begin to construct things inside the city. Like Nehemiah, when he first started, he didn't start with the city, with the temple, and repairing what's going on inside the city. He started with the wall. Because without the wall, the enemy can come in at any time, destroy everything. There are 3 stages in the spiritual life. The first one is purification. It's part of what we were just talking about. It's the struggle with the passions in order to order them, to bring them from chaos back to order, to have mastery over them, so that they're no longer working against you, but for you. The second is illumination. And in this stage, our main focus, our main concern is the knowledge of God. The knowledge of God. Now, this is difficult living in the city. It's much more difficult than living out in the country. Living in the country, you're surrounded by nature. Naturally, you contemplate nature and leads you to the contemplation of God. But here in the city, we're just too busy, too distracted, and even if we get half a second to just close your eyes and contemplate something and think about something, you're always you're surrounded by all these things, by buildings, by trains, by cars, by noise, by pollution, all sorts of things that are not natural, right? They're all man-made stuff. It leads us to the contemplation of our own greatness. Look how awesome we are, all the nice things we've built and invented, and all the great achievements we've done. There's actually a book written by a 16-year-old who, he went to monasticism at 16, and he's very good in the habit of a monastery, and one of his friends asked him to write this book, St. John Climacus, the Ladder of Divine Ascent. And basically it's these 30 rungs of a ladder based on Jacob's vision that takes the person from earth to heaven. And we build on, each step builds on the one before it. And each step is essential to the step above it. It's not just like you can jump into the 5th and try to figure, like, you need to continue to practice 1 through 4 in order to be able to do anything with the 5th step. And the last step, they call it dispassion. Dispassion. This is akin to being like God. Dispassion is where your passions are ordered, is where it's not apathy, it's not you feel like apathetic and you don't care about things and you don't care about people, but you're not moved by your passions. You're not, like, for example, you really want this job, and then you go to God to pray, God, please give me this job. Instead, with dispassion, you go to God and you ask God for His will to be done, whether I get the job or not, whether I make it into this program or not, whether I marry this person or not. Let your will be done. And the last stage in that 3 stages, purification, illumination, is perfection, where our passions, our bodies are in order, are in check, our minds are awake, our souls are nourished, and we begin to have this Christ-like mentality. We begin to have the heart of God. We begin to see others the way God sees them. We begin to live out this likeness of God, created in the image and according to His likeness, and we begin to live it out in our everyday lives. All the stuff I said today isn't earth-shattering, isn't anything new, nothing that you haven't heard before. But the trick to it is keeping it in mind every day, not just keeping it for special occasions. Any other questions?
fathers, the church fathers or the monks share in the three-step process, or is this something that?
Yes, they wrote a lot about it, and there are two categories we need to distinguish with. Church fathers, these are writings about dogma, about faith, about church canons, rules, so they're more technical. But the other writings are technical too, but they're more spiritual in nature, like desert fathers. So they have spiritual writings, like the 50 spiritual homilies of St. Macarius, for example. They talk about the spiritual struggle and what it means for the struggle to be in the heart, and what happens in the heart, and how the mind descends in the heart, and how the devil gets in your heart, and the battle that ensues, and so on.
So I had more like a comment on the thought from the beginning that we talked about. I feel like sometimes when people get the thought, they'll be like, why is this thought even in my mind? And I think that it's a good point what you made, that just because the thought's in your mind, you don't take the bait. That moment where you pause and it's not. But I feel like some people fall into sin because they're like, okay, the thought's already there. It shouldn't be there, kind of thing, and then it just continues.
Absolutely. And the point you're making about being guilty is valid, because we feel guilty that we're thinking this way. It makes us weak. So anything done out of guilt, out of shame, out of fear is not going to lead us anywhere good. And any change born out of these is not very long lasting. So if someone shames you into a good deed or into stopping something bad, it's not going to work very long. Pretty soon you're going to, back to normal.
Where can I read more about the three-step process?
Okay. I have a list of books that I can recommend to you. If you have a mailing list, I can send it to Aki and then you can set it up.
Sure.
I'll send out a few articles too, because some of these books you might want. They're a bit expensive, but I'll send some free articles. And they're easier to get things started. It would be nice if we had a library here. You can actually borrow some of these books, but for now, yes.
Is nourishment of the soul and spiritual warfare related?
So say that again.
Is nourishment of the soul and spiritual warfare related?
Yes, absolutely. Because if your soul is no good to you, you're really at the mercy of circumstance. You're at the mercy of the devil, of any thought that's in your mind. There's really no resistance, right? But the nourishing of the soul, this fighting chance, allows your soul to dictate the terms of the fight. Allows your soul really to lead your whole being somewhere positive, somewhere good, and not just to be taken around and taken captive.
Any other questions?
Do you know that in every baptism we perform an exorcism?
Yes. I denounce you say that.
No, not in the Hollywood sense. Like the baby isn't possessed by an evil spirit. The exorcism is the reclaiming of something for its original purpose, the purpose it was intended for, the purpose it was created for. That's what an exorcism is. It's not like what you see in the movies and I cast you out and stuff like that. It's not that. So that's why in every baptism, part of the prayer is that exorcism, where that child, where that person is reclaimed for that purpose they were created for. All of us, we've been reclaimed to that purpose we were created for. But we walk away from that purpose from time to time. We drift away from that purpose from time to time. Being awake, being watchful, is us keeping to that purpose that we were reclaimed for. That purpose to walk according to the name by which we are called, by the calling that God calls us with. Hollywood got almost everything wrong about Christianity. So if there's something that you only know from Hollywood, chances are it's wrong. It's probably the opposite.
Thank you, Huna. Thank you, Huna, for the talk. So to answer Yusuf's question, as soon as Huna